The rope swung in the wind like it had already hanged him. It was a length of good hemp, thick as his thumb, bleached pale by a sun that had no mercy for anything. It twisted on a slow, patient axis, its shadow a serpent writhing in the dust on the gallows platform. Arlen Corr watched it, not with fear, but with the grim appraisal of a craftsman. He'd braided ropes like that himself, tied knots that held fast against the frantic weight of men whose names were worth a pouch of federal coin. He knew the physics of the drop, the precise measure of slack needed for a clean break. This rope was well made. The town of Redemption, a place he'd helped clear with rifle and fire, at least owed him that much. The wind was a dry tongue licking the back of his neck, whispering through the raw timber of the scaffold. It carried the smell of the crowd, sweat, cheap whiskey, the cloying scent of piety from the women in their Sunday bonnets. He saw their faces, a pale sea of them pressed against the perimeter line the marshal had drawn in the dirt. Faces he recognized. Jebediah Smith, the blacksmith, whose forge he'd protected from raiders 2 winters past, now stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of grim satisfaction. Old Man Hemlock, the general store proprietor who'd once paid him a bonus for a particularly troublesome bounty, now spat a wad of tobacco that landed just shy of the platform stairs. Their eyes were hard. They were the eyes of people who had paid for peace with another man's violence and were now ready to pay for their own clean conscience with his death. The preacher, a gaunt man named Elias Thorne, was droning on from the foot of the gallows. His voice was a saw blade cutting through the morning air, speaking of sin and damnation, of a righteous God and the cleansing fire. Arlen didn't listen to the words, only the rhythm. It was the same rhythm he'd heard in war drums, in the pounding of a blacksmith's hammer, in the final frantic heartbeat of a man bleeding out in the mesquite. It was the sound of something ending, his own ending. His hands were bound behind him with rawhide that bit into his wrists. The marshal, a young man named Calloway, whom Arlen had once thought of as soft, had tied the knots himself. Calloway stood beside him now, his face pale, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was trying to look stern, official. He just looked scared, scared of Arlen even now, scared of the rope, scared of what the town was becoming. Arlen Corr, the marshal's voice cracked, trying to project over the preacher's sermon. Have you any last words? The preacher fell silent. The wind died. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. It pressed in, filled with the weight of every eye upon him. Arlen felt the sun on his face, a warmth that would soon be a forgotten memory. He thought of all the things he could say. He could curse them. He could spit their hypocrisy back in their faces. He could tell them that the ground they stood on was salted with the bones of men he'd killed for their prosperity. He could beg, but the thought was so foreign it was like trying to speak a language he'd never heard. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over them one last time. He saw the hunger in their faces, the need for this final act to wipe the slate clean, to make them forget that he was a monster of their own making. And in that moment, he decided to give them nothing. His silence would be his final, defiant act. He looked past them, to the jagged line of the Dragoon Mountains, hazy purple in the distance. He'd chased men into those canyons. He'd slept under those stars, the cold stone a mattress for his back. He'd felt a kind of freedom there that these townspeople, with their fences and their laws, would never understand. He would die thinking of the mountains, not of them. He gave the marshal a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Let's get on with it. Calloway swallowed hard and reached for the black hood. But as his hand moved, a sound disrupted the perfect, terrible stillness. It wasn't a shout or a cry. It was the soft, rhythmic scuff of bare feet on hard-packed earth. A ripple went through the crowd, a murmur that started at the edge and moved inward like a slow wave. The sea of faces parted. People turned, stepping aside not as if commanded, but as if repelled by a force they couldn't see. They moved with a shared instinctive reluctance, their expressions shifting from righteous anger to a confused primal unease. Through the newly formed aisle she walked. She was a girl, maybe 16 summers old, maybe less. Apache. Her black hair was parted in the center, stark and severe against the brown skin of her face. She wore a simple doeskin dress, worn soft with use. Her feet were bare, powdered with the same red dust that coated the boots of the men who now stared at her, their mouths agape. She carried nothing in her hands, but her presence was heavier than any weapon. Her face was a mask of utter neutrality. There was no plea in her eyes, no anger, no fear. There was only a stillness that mirrored the vast, empty sky above them. She walked directly toward the gallows, her pace unhurried, each step a deliberate, measured beat in the suffocating silence. The preacher, Elias Thorne, stepped into her path, his hand raised as if to ward off a spirit. "This is a place of Christian justice, girl," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "There is no place for you here. Go back to your people." She did not look at him. Her eyes, black and deep as a desert well, remained fixed on Arlen. It was a gaze that pierced through the noise, through the crowd, through the years of blood and dust, and landed squarely on him. It was not a look of judgment. It was a look of recognition. She moved around the preacher as if he were a stone in a river, the current of her purpose flowing past him without disturbance. Marshal Calloway drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the frozen air. "That's far enough," he ordered, his voice trembling. "This is official business. I will have you removed." Two deputies started forward from the edge of the crowd, their hands on their own sidearms, but they stopped as she reached the bottom step of the gallows. She paused there for a single heartbeat, and in that pause, Arlen saw it. Tied to the leather thong around her right wrist was a braid of black hair. It was thick and long, woven with discipline and care. At its end, it was bound with a strip of faded blue cloth. The world tilted for Arlen Kaur. The sun-bleached platform, the expectant faces, the purple mountains, they all blurred into a sickening haze. The braid was a ghost's hand, reaching out from the grave. He remembered it. He remembered the feel of it, coarse and vital, in his own hand. He remembered the sun glinting off it, just as it was glinting now. A woman named Nalin Kay, which meant strong willow. He'd cornered her and her brother in a box canyon north of the Verde River. The bounty was for the brother, a renegade named Taza who had killed a prospector. Arlen had killed him. The woman had fought like a cornered lynx, and when it was over, he stood over her, his rifle hot in his hands. He'd told the story in the Redemption Saloon afterwards, to the rapt attention of the very men who now wanted him dead. He'd told them he'd spared her. A moment of mercy, he'd called it. A gesture of respect for her bravery. He'd left her with a water skin and let her go. He'd made himself the hero of his own brutal tale. The braid on the girl's wrist told the truth. He had not let her go. He had cut the braid from her head, a trophy, and then he had walked away, leaving her with no water, no weapon, nothing but the shorn shame of her hair and the certainty of a slow death under the Arizona sun. He had taken her story and twisted it into his own. The girl on the steps was a walking, breathing refutation of the one decent act he'd ever claimed. She began to climb the stairs. Her bare feet made no sound on the raw wood. Calloway took a step back, his pistol wavering. The crowd was a collection of statues, their collective will broken by a mystery they could not fathom. This was not in the script. This was not part of the clean, righteous ritual of execution. She stopped in front of Arlen. She was so close he could smell the scent of sage and clean earth on her skin. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in the depths of her black eyes. It was not hatred. It was something far older, something heavier. It was the weight of a memory that was not her own. She lifted her hand, the one with the braid tied to the wrist. The severed hair swayed, a dead thing tied to a living pulse. The crowd let out a collective, strangled gasp. They thought she was going to strike him, to exact a savage revenge, but she did not. Slowly, reverently, she reached out and took his bound hand in hers. Her fingers were cool and firm. They closed around his rough, calloused knuckles. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of ownership, a claim. Her thumb rested on his pulse point, and he felt his own blood thrumming against her skin, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She looked him dead in the eye, and the town, for the first time, went quiet. The wind stopped. The preacher's mouth hung open. The marshal's gun hand dropped to his side. The serpent shadow of the rope on the platform floor lay perfectly still. In that silence, there was only the pressure of her hand on his, a silent, unbreakable covenant. She did not plead. She did not flinch. She simply stood there, a silent anchor in a world that had come unmoored. She held his gaze, and in her eyes he saw the box canyon. He saw the shimmering heat. He saw the woman, Nalan Kay, on her knees in the dust. He saw the flash of his own knife as he severed the braid. He was not just seeing a memory. He was seeing it through the girl's eyes. He was seeing the inheritance of his own cruelty. The silence was broken by Jebediah Smith, the blacksmith. His voice was thick with outrage. "What in God's name is this? Get that squaw down from there. She's defiling a Christian proceeding." "Marshal, do your duty," Old Man Hemlock screeched, his face purple. "Remove her. Hang the killer." The crowd, given a voice, surged with renewed purpose. The spell was broken, replaced by a furious indignation. "Get her off!" "Hang him! Hang him now!" Marshal Calloway jolted back to action, raised his pistol again. "Girl, I am giving you one final warning. Let go of the prisoner." She did not move. Her grip on Arlen's hand did not loosen. She was the eye of the storm, and the fury of the town washed over her without effect. The two deputies, emboldened by the crowd, rushed up the stairs. One grabbed her shoulder, his thick fingers digging into the thin doeskin of her dress. "You heard the marshal—" He never finished the sentence. From the ridge overlooking the town, a sound arose. It was not a war cry. It was a single, sustained note, low and resonant, that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of a human voice, yet it felt older than any man. It vibrated in Arlen's bones, in the wood of the gallows, in the very air they breathed. Every head in the crowd turned. On the crest of the sun-drenched ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky, were riders. A dozen of them, maybe more. They sat on their ponies, still as the rock formations around them. They were not painted for war. They wore no feathers of aggression. They simply sat, watching. Their stillness was more menacing than any charge could ever be. They were not here to fight. They were here to bear witness. The low, resonant note sounded again, this time joined by others, a harmony that spoke of canyons and ancient winds. It was not a song of battle, but a song of judgment. The deputy who had grabbed the girl's shoulder snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He and his partner stumbled back down the stairs, their faces ashen. The crowd fell silent again, but this was a different silence. The first had been one of anticipation, the second of shock. This was a silence of fear, a primal dread. They were settlers, farmers, merchants. Their world was one of deeds and contracts, of fences and laws written in books. The figures on that ridge represented a law that was written in the movement of the stars, in the memory of the land itself. One of the riders separated from the group and began a slow descent down the long, winding trail that led to the town. He was an old man, his face a road map of seasons, his long gray hair unbound. He rode without a saddle, his movements one with the horse beneath him. He was unarmed, carrying only a long, gnarled staff of ironwood. The girl on the gallows did not turn to look. She did not need to. Her purpose here was now supported by the weight of her entire people, by the silent authority of the man who was now entering the outskirts of redemption. The old man rode directly to the foot of the gallows and dismounted. The pony stood ground-hitched, patient. He looked up, his eyes passing over the marshal, the preacher, the executioner. He looked at Arlen and then at the girl. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, not to her, but to the act she was performing, to the connection of their hands. Marshal Calloway found his voice, though it was thin and unsteady. This is the sovereign town of redemption, under the laws of the Arizona Territory. This man, Arlen Core, has been tried by a jury and sentenced to hang for the crime of murder. The old man's gaze was like chips of obsidian. He did not seem to hear the marshal's words, or if he did, he considered them irrelevant, like the buzzing of a fly. He looked at Arlen, his eyes boring into him, seeing not just the man who stood on the gallows, but the long, bloody trail he had carved across the land. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the entire plaza. It was the voice that had sung from the ridge, a voice that seemed to draw its power from the ground. He spoke in his own tongue, the words flowing like water over smooth stones, ancient and undeniable. The words were not angry. They were heavy, with a sorrow that was older than the town, older than the rope, older than the laws of the territory. When he finished, a profound stillness settled. No one in the crowd understood the words, but they understood the meaning. This was a verdict that superseded their own. The old man, whose name was Chatto, which meant flat-nose, though the whites knew him only as the elder, then looked directly at Marshal Calloway. He spoke again, this time in a halting, heavily accented English, the words carefully chosen, each one a stone dropped into a deep well. "This man," he said, gesturing with his chin toward Arlen, "is not yours to kill." The preacher, Thorne, sputtered, his piety giving way to pure fury. "He is a murderer. The word of God demands a life for a life. He is a sinner who must meet his Maker." Chatto's gaze shifted to the preacher, and for the first time, a flicker of something cold and hard appeared in his eyes. "Your God demands a life. Our way demands a balance. Death is a release. It is an escape. This man has created too much silence. He will not be allowed to join it so easily." He turned his attention back to the marshal. "You hang him, you make him a ghost. A ghost is free. He goes where he will. His story ends. This is not justice. This is waste." He gestured again toward Arlen, and then to the girl, whose hand was still locked with his. "She," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "is Nalin K's daughter. Her name is Sonsi Array, Morning Star. She was born in the season her mother was taken from this world by him." A wave of understanding, cold and horrifying, washed over the crowd. This was not a random act of defiance. This was a debt being called due. "He took her mother's life, her story," Chatto continued, his voice rising just enough to command absolute attention. "Now, his life belongs to her story. He will not die. He will be her witness. He will walk the land he scarred. He will see the places where the families he broke once lived. He will carry the memory of the woman he left for the son. He will learn the weight of the braid she now carries. His punishment will not be to die. His punishment will be to live every day, remembering what he tried to forget. He is to be unmade. He will be a vessel for the silence he created, and she will be his keeper." A long, collective sigh seemed to escape from the people of redemption. The simple, satisfying finality of the hanging was being stolen from them, replaced by a strange, terrifying poetry they couldn't grasp. That's not the law," Calloway stammered, clinging to the one thing that made sense to him. Chatto took a step closer. The air crackled with his presence. "It is our law. It is the law of the memory of the earth. He spilled blood on our land. The debt is owed to the land, not to your rope." He looked up at Arlen, whose face was a mask of disbelief. The world he knew, a world of clear lines, of kill or be killed, of coin for a corpse, was dissolving. He was being sentenced not to death, but to something worse, a life that was no longer his own. The old man looked at Calloway. "You will cut his bonds. You will take the rope from his neck. He is ours now." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Calloway looked from the old man to the silent figures on the ridge. He looked at his own townspeople, their righteous anger now diluted with a superstitious fear. He looked at the gallows, which now seemed like a flimsy, profane stage. And he looked at the girl, Sonse Array, her small hand holding the notorious bounty killer captive with more strength than any iron chains. He saw the braid on her wrist. He saw the truth in it. And in that moment, he understood that the town's justice was a small, paltry thing compared to the reckoning that had just arrived. With a shaking hand, Marshal Calloway holstered his pistol. He walked slowly up the gallows steps, his boots loud in the unnatural quiet. He pulled a knife from his belt. He did not look at Arlen. He could not. He reached behind him and with 2 swift cuts severed the rawhide biting into Arlen's wrists. Arlen's hands fell to his sides, numb and tingling. He instinctively flexed his fingers, the feeling slowly returning. But the girl's hand did not let go. Her grip remained, a cool, constant pressure. The executioner, a hulking man who had been paid $20 for the job, moved forward and, with trembling fingers, lifted the noose from Arlen's neck. The rough hemp scraped against his skin, leaving a raw red mark. The rope, now cheated of its purpose, was coiled and dropped to the platform with a dull, final thud. He was free. But he had never felt more like a prisoner. Sonse Array turned. Still holding his hand, she began to lead him toward the stairs. Her pull was not forceful, but it was undeniable. It was the pull of the tide. He followed, his legs stiff and unsteady. He was a man walking away from his own execution, but it did not feel like a reprieve. It felt like the beginning of something infinitely worse. He descended the steps, his boots making a hollow sound on the wood. She led him, barefoot and silent, across the dusty plaza. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and thwarted bloodlust. He could feel their eyes on his back, but he did not turn. His world had shrunk to the small, firm hand holding his and the impassive face of the girl who led him. Chado watched them approach, his expression unchanging. As they passed, he fell into step behind them. The rest of the riders on the ridge had begun their descent, forming a silent, solemn escort. They walked past the blacksmith's shop, past the general store, past the saloon where he had bragged of his mercy. They walked toward the edge of town, where the flimsy structures of wood and law gave way to the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert. As they reached the last building, the marshal's office, Sonse Array stopped. She looked down at Arlen's feet, at the heavy, dusty boots that had carried him across hundreds of miles of territory in pursuit of his bloody trade. Then she looked up at him. It was the first command she had given, and it was unspoken. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of his old defiance rising in his chest. But then he looked into her eyes, and he saw the canyon again. He saw the sun. He saw the thirst. He saw the long, slow walk to oblivion that he had sentenced her mother to. Slowly, awkwardly, he bent down and unlaced his boots. He pulled them off, the worn leather still warm from his feet. He stood up, the hot, sharp grit of the ground a shock to his soles. He was barefoot, just like her. She gave a single, small nod, and then she turned and began to walk again, pulling him with her, away from the town of redemption, away from the man he had been. He left his boots, his name, his past, lying in the dust at the edge of the town he helped carve from blood. The sun was climbing higher, the heat building. The trail ahead was nothing but rock and sand and shimmering air. Arlen Kaur, the notorious bounty killer, walked into the wilderness, his hand held by a silent Apache girl who carried a braid once worn by a woman he claimed to spare. The price of being remembered by the one soul who should have let him die was a long, slow walk into the heart of the silence he had created. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any noose, that this walk would not end until he had heard every last echo of it. The landscape was a relentless witness. Every sun-bleached rock, every skeletal finger of Ocotillo clawing at the sky, every ripple of heat rising from the sand was a testament to the world he had profited from. In his old life, this had been his office, his hunting ground. He'd read the land for signs, a turned stone, a broken branch, the faintest scuff of a footprint. He read it for the story of another man's desperation, a story that always ended with Arlen's payday. Now, the land told a different story. It told his. He walked behind Sansiare. She never looked back, but he was tethered to her as surely as if a rope connected their necks. Her pace was steady, economical, born of a life lived in this harshness. His was the clumsy gait of a man whose body was a weapon, but a weapon unsuited for this kind of penance. His feet, softened by years in boots, were quickly blistered, then cut. He left a faint trail of blood in the dust, mingling with his own footprints. The pain was a constant, nagging reminder of his new state. The other riders, the escort of silent judges, fanned out around them, always present, but never close. They were shadows at the edge of his vision, a constant peripheral reminder that this was not an escape. Chato, the elder, sometimes rode closer, his ironwood staff resting across his thighs, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the horizon, as if he were navigating by memories. They did not speak to him. The silence was a wall, a physical presence. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a merciless sun. At dusk, they would make a simple camp. Sansiare would give him a piece of dried meat and a gourd of water, just enough to keep him alive. She would hand it to him without looking at him, her movements efficient, devoid of either pity or contempt. It was the detached care one might give to a tool or a beast of burden. He ate, he drank, and he watched her. In the firelight, her face was a study in shadows. He looked for any sign of her thoughts, any flicker of the girl beneath the implacable keeper. He saw nothing, but he saw her mother, Nalin K. The ghost was always there, just behind Sonsiare's eyes. The curve of her cheek, the way she held her head, the quiet strength in her hands. It was all an echo. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake with a jolt, the phantom feel of the noose around his neck. He would sit up, his heart hammering against his ribs, and see her sitting awake by the dying embers of the fire, watching him. Her gaze in the darkness was not threatening. It was simply there, a constant, unwavering observation. She was his living conscience, the mirror he could not break. He began to lose track of time. A week, a month, the seasons began to turn. The searing heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool nights of autumn. His body hardened. The blisters on his feet became thick calluses. The sun burned his skin the color of old leather. The fat he'd accumulated from town living melted away, leaving behind the hard muscle and sinew of his old life. But it felt different now. It was not the strength of a predator, but the endurance of a penitent. His mind, stripped of all its usual distractions, the planning of a hunt, the counting of coin, the taste of whiskey, began to turn inward. He had too much time to think. The silence forced him to listen to the cacophony in his own head, and the memories came. Not the glorious, self-aggrandizing versions he'd told in saloons, but the real ones, unearthed from the boneyard of his soul. He remembered a homesteader named Silas Croft, wanted for jumping his claim. Arlen had tracked him for a week. He hadn't brought him in. He'd found him already dead from a snake bite, his face swollen and black. But the bounty was for Croft, dead or alive. Arlen had put a bullet in the corpse's head to make it look clean, to avoid questions. He'd collected the full amount. He remembered a young kid from the Pima tribe, barely a man, accused of stealing a horse. Arlen had cornered him in a wash. The kid had thrown down his only weapon, a small knife, and tried to surrender. Arlen had shot him anyway. It was easier than taking a prisoner all the way back to Prescott. He'd buried him in a shallow grave and told the marshal the kid had pulled a gun on him. And he remembered Nalin K. The memory was the sharpest of all. It played over and over in his mind, each detail more vivid than the last. He hadn't just left her to die. He had enjoyed it. He had relished the power he held over her, the way her defiant eyes had finally clouded with despair when he'd walked away. The braid had not been a mere trophy. It had been an act of pure, calculated cruelty, a way to break her spirit before her body gave out. He'd taken her identity, her connection to her people, and left her with nothing. One evening, as he chewed on a tough piece of jerky, he looked at Sonseire. The braid was always on her wrist. The faded blue cloth at its end was frayed now, worn from the journey. "Why?" he asked. The sound of his own voice was a shock, a harsh, grating noise in the sacred quiet. "Why didn't you let them hang me?" Sonseire did not look up from the small pouch she was mending with an awl and sinew. Her hands did not stop their work. Chato, sitting cross-legged nearby, was the one who answered. "A dead man cannot learn," the old man said, his English still halting, but his meaning clear as ever. "A dead man cannot carry a weight." "What weight?" Arlen rasped. Chato looked at him, his eyes ancient. "The weight of the story. You took her story," he said, nodding toward the memory of Nalin that hung between them all. "Now you will carry it. You will carry it until you understand what it is made of." Arlen fell silent. He did not understand. He understood guilt. He was beginning to understand shame. But this idea of carrying a story, of a life as a vessel for a memory, it was a foreign language. Their journey had a rhythm, but it was not aimless. Chato led them through canyons and across mesas, following trails that were invisible to Arlen's eyes. They were moving through a map of ghosts. One day, they stopped at the ruins of a small jacal structure, its mud walls crumbling back into the earth. A few shards of broken pottery lay half-buried in the dust. Chato dismounted and stood before the ruin for a long time. "A family lived here," he said, his voice low. "A man, a woman, 2 children. The man was called Kills the Deer. You took him for the silver miners in Globe. You said he stole from them." Arlen remembered. A small bounty, barely worth the ride. He remembered the man's face, defiant to the end. He had never thought about the jackal, or the woman, or the children. They were externalities. They were not part of the transaction. Sonseire walked to the crumbling doorway and placed her hand on the sun-warmed adobe. She closed her eyes. Arlen watched her, a cold dread creeping up his spine. She was not just seeing the ruin. She was feeling the empty space. She was listening to the silence where a family used to be, and she was making him watch her do it. This became the pattern. They would travel for days, and then they would arrive at a place. A dry riverbed where he had ambushed 2 brothers, a stand of cottonwoods where he had left a man to hang, a cave where a family had hidden before he dragged the father out into the light. At each stop, Chato would tell the story, the real story, the names, the families, the lies Arlen had told, and at each stop, Sonseire would perform her silent ritual. She would touch a stone, a tree, a piece of earth. She would close her eyes and stand in the heart of the absence he had created. Arlen was not just being shown the consequences of his actions. He was being forced to participate in their remembrance. He was a captive audience to the litany of his own sins. The physical hardship of the journey was nothing compared to this. This was an erosion of the soul. The man he had been, the hard, practical man who believed only in coin and survival, was being ground down, turned into dust. One afternoon, they came to a place that felt different. A narrow box canyon, with sheer rock walls the color of dried blood. The air was still and hot. Arlen felt the hair on his arms stand up. He knew this place. He knew it in his bones. This was where he had killed Taza. This was where he had cut the braid from Nalankai's head. Chato stopped at the entrance to the canyon. The other riders kept their distance, forming a silent cordon. Only Chato, Sonsei Array, and Arlen went forward. They walked into the canyon, their footsteps echoing off the high stone walls. "Here," Chato said, his voice barely a whisper. The single word was heavier than a gravestone. Sonsei Array walked to the center of the canyon floor. She knelt, the dust puffing up around her. Arlen stood frozen, his feet rooted to the spot. The memory was no longer in his head. It was all around him. He could see it, smell it, taste it. He saw Taza fall, his chest a ruin. He saw Nalankai's face, contorted with grief and rage. He saw his own hand holding the knife. He saw the flash of the blade. Sonsei Array untied the leather thong from her wrist. She held the braid, her mother's hair, in her hands. She held it with a reverence that made Arlen's gut twist. For him, it had been a trophy. For her, it was a sacred relic. It was all she had left. She looked up at him. For the first time since that day on the gallows, she looked directly at him with an expression he could read. It was not anger. It was not a plea. It was a command. She held the braid out to him. He stared at it, his mind reeling. What did she want? Did she want him to bury it? To destroy it? "Take it," Chato said, his voice firm. Arlen's hand trembled as he reached out. His calloused, scarred fingers brushed against hers as he took the braid. It felt heavier than he remembered. It felt alive. The hair was coarse, vital. He could feel the ghost of the life that had grown it. He held in his hand the proof of his most profound cruelty. Sonsei Array rose to her feet. She pointed to a spot a few yards away, near the base of the canyon wall. There was a small pile of stones there, almost unnoticeable. A grave marker, Apache style. Nalankai's grave. Her people had found her. They had given her the burial he had denied her. She looked at him, then at the grave, then back at him. The command was clear. He had to give it back. He walked toward the pile of stones, each step a lifetime. The man he had been would have laughed at this. He would have thrown the braid in the dust and walked away. But that man was gone, scoured out of him by miles of desert and the weight of a silent gaze. He knelt before the grave. The stones were warm from the sun. He looked at the braid in his hand. This was the story. This was the weight Chato had spoken of. It was made of hair, of cloth, of sun and dust and blood and memory. It was the weight of a life, a culture, a spirit he had tried and failed to extinguish. He closed his eyes. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew he was beyond that. Forgiveness was a town word, a preacher's word. This was something else. This was about balance. He gently laid the braid on top of the stones. The faded blue cloth stood out against the red rock. He had taken it in violence. He was returning it in ceremony. He was a participant in the mending of a world he had torn. He stayed there, kneeling, for a long time. The sun began to dip below the canyon rim, painting the walls in shades of orange and purple. When he finally looked up, Sonsei Array was standing a few feet away, watching him. Her face was still unreadable, but the hardness around her eyes seemed to have softened just a fraction. The space on her wrist, where the braid had been, was pale and bare. She had passed the burden of the physical object to him, and in doing so had transferred the final, heaviest part of its story. He had carried it. He had returned it. He had, in his own broken way, finished the task. He thought, perhaps, that this was the end, that they would leave him here, that his service was done. But when he rose to his feet, Sonse turned and began to walk out of the canyon. Chato fell into step beside her. After a moment, Arlen understood. He was to follow. The punishment was not over. Returning the braid was not the end of the sentence. It was just the first word. He had been a witness to the places of his crimes. He had been a witness to the return of what he had stolen. Now his penance would enter a new phase. They left the canyon behind. The escort of riders was still there, waiting. But as they journeyed on, Arlen noticed a change. Before, he had been given food and water as one would tend to livestock. Now, the routine was different. In the evenings, when they made camp, Sonse would prepare the food, but she would set his portion down between them. She would sit and eat her own meal, and he would eat his. The silence remained, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer a wall, it was a space they shared. He began to truly see the world he was in, not as a map of bounties and dangers, but as a living thing. He watched Sonse. He saw how she found water where he saw only dry rock. He saw how she read the clouds, the wind. He saw her gather plants, her hands moving with an innate knowledge. She knew the names of everything, the purpose of everything. This land that he had seen only as an obstacle, a place of death, was her home. It was a place of immense and intricate life. He started to learn, not because anyone taught him, but because he watched. He learned which plants held water in their roots. He learned to recognize the tracks of a javelina, not as a target, but as a fellow traveler. He learned the rhythm of the sun and the moon. The world began to open up to him in a way it never had when he was its conqueror. Months turned into a year, then 2. His hair grew long and gray, and his beard was untrimmed. He was lean and hard, his skin the color of the earth he walked on. He no longer looked like Arlen Kor, the bounty killer. He looked like something that had grown out of the desert itself. His relationship with Sonse remained unspoken. She was his keeper, and he was her witness. But the nature of it had changed. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a student. And she, without ever saying a word, was his teacher. She was teaching him the language of the world he had tried to destroy. One day, they were walking through a high plateau dotted with juniper trees. A cold wind blew from the north, carrying the promise of the first snow. Arlen saw a set of tracks and stopped. They were large, feline. A mountain lion, a big one, had passed this way recently. In his old life, this would have been a threat or a challenge. He looked at Sonse. She had seen the tracks, too. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he did not see her mother in her eyes. He saw her. He saw the young woman she had become. He gave a slight nod toward the tracks, a gesture of acknowledgement, a shared understanding. She nodded back. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a recognition passed across her face. It was the first time. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall of silence that had defined his existence for years. But it was everything. He had not been redeemed. He had not been forgiven. A man like him could never be truly washed clean. But he had been remade. He had been forced to witness the devastation he had wrought, and in that witnessing, he had learned to see. He had learned the weight of a life, the depth of a silence. They continued their walk, the cold wind at their backs. He walked behind her, his gaze no longer on the ground searching for his own pain, but on the horizon. He did not know where they were going. He did not know when it would end. He had finally learned that the journey was the destination. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to the memory of a woman named Nalin Kay, and it was in the keeping of her daughter, Sonse. He was Arlen Kor, the witness. And his punishment was to walk the earth, not until he died, but until he had learned every word of the story he had once tried to erase. The final moment would not be a drop from the gallows, but the slow, patient, inevitable understanding that his life had been given a new, terrible, and sacred purpose: to remember. And he knew, as he watched her walk ahead of him, her form silhouetted against the vast, unforgiving sky, that he would carry that weight for all the days he had left, a silent testament to the girl who should have let him die, but who had, instead, sentenced him to live.